Mark Carney has 3 passports: Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland. A globalist with options. He hasn't seen Canada in a decade. Calls himself a European, not a Canadian.
As a European, I am a European, actually.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, I'm a citizen.
Told U.S. Congress last year he's a Brit. He's back to lord over you. Canada's not his home. It's his throne.
Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. It is Thursday, May the 1st. On our minds tonight is what's next for Canada's Conservatives. Since 2011, they have never won more seats in Parliament than they did on Monday, and with 41% of the popular vote, any party leader would expect to be Prime Minister. But thanks to the migration of the NDP vote to the Liberals, Pierre Poilievre is not Prime Minister. In fact, he lost his seat. With me tonight to talk about these things is Ginny Roth. She is a partner at Crestview Strategies, former communications director for the party, and a long-time Poilievre interpreter. Good evening, Ginny.
Lovely to be here, Nigel.
Very nice to have you. Thank you for taking the time. Ginny, there's a lot of talk about here in Western Canada, in Calgary, and in the circles in which we move about how Mr. Poilievre will now have to face a leadership review. Does he have the support to stay as leader?
Yes, much more so, historically so, I would say. If we look at the last 2 leaders, in Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer, people might remember they had to go to many ballots to win their leadership race. I mean, they just barely won the leadership race. They then, maybe more members fell in behind them and supported them as they went on. But when they lost, they really had to confront some members who were already displeased with them and just were not predisposed to be big fans. Poilievre is sort of in the opposite situation. He has a strong hold on the membership. They're all naturally big fans of his. There will be people who will certainly be disappointed with the results. But I think that there's quite a bit of unanimity, both in the membership and in the party caucus and the parliamentary caucus, that he is just the best chance we have at winning the next election. And that he grew the coalition, he increased the vote share, he increased the seat count. And so, the wrinkle of him having lost his own seat is unhelpful, certainly. It allows for a media narrative that's a bit more negative. But I don't think that will ultimately be something that undermines him with the membership, which feels actually, I think, quite energized and excited about getting to the next election.
Certainly when you see some of those vast rallies that he assembled, it's hard to imagine how that level of support could just melt away in a moment. Jenny, when is the leadership review?
As I understand it, there is one scheduled at a convention in the fall. I think it's September. And I think if I were Poilievre, I would really welcome that. I would sort of say, we shouldn't try to delay this. We've got a mandated process in our constitution. Members should always have their say, and I really look forward to a leadership review because I'm just confident I'm going to do well, and I'm going to get a strong endorsement from the membership. I think that presents a kind of a confidence and a comfort that the members will support him, and it gives him some time to kind of speak to caucus, speak to Canadians. Maybe talk about what was successful, and maybe potentially talk about areas for improvement and ways that we can maybe do better next time.
Do you think that he can get a seat between now and then?
I don't know that he could get a seat between now and then, in part because the prime minister gets to control the timing of the by-election. And if I were the prime minister, I would say, what would Pierre Poilievre do for me if I was trying to get a seat in the House of Commons? And I think he would be right in suggesting that Poilievre would not give him any grace. And so I don't expect. And I think Poilievre should plan that the Liberals and the Prime Minister will make the timing as difficult for him as possible. And I believe they don't have to have a by-election until 6 months after a vacancy. So they could drag that out. I think it's fine because Poilievre can appoint someone to lead question period in the House of Commons. He can still talk to media in Ottawa the way he would after question period, were he the leader in the House of Commons. And he can tour Canada. He can meet with members. He can meet with Canadians. He can host rallies. He can do everything else he would do as a leader. He could post social media videos, etc.
Okay, well, that's any ideas who might volunteer to take one for the team?
I don't know. There had been some rumblings about Alberta. He has quite a deep connection to Calgary, having grown up in the city. And Calgary also has the benefit of being a safer environment in a city for conservatives. There are parts of Calgary, as you know, that are very safe territory for conservatives. Someone will have to give up a seat. It'll have to be done voluntarily. He's not going to make someone do it. I think someone would have to come forward and think it makes sense. Maybe there are some MPs who were giving it one last shot, thinking, I'll get to be part of a governing caucus, who are now a little bit disappointed and ready to move on. I don't know. I'm sure these conversations are happening behind the scenes. My hope for him is that he gets a strong conservative seat so that he can have the support there, build some relationships there, do some constituency work, but mainly focus on trying to lead the Conservatives across the whole country.
Jenny, before we examine the entrails of the campaign itself, you're right that he has a very large following here in Calgary. Can you just tell people who are concerned about him personally how he's doing? And he and Anna have to move out of Stornoway, I guess. There's lots of things happening all at once.
I think they will have to. Look, we're only 3 days from the election, and this is a guy who goes nonstop. I don't know if I think you know him a little bit, and he's a borderline workaholic. And for those who saw some of the video footage from the last rally he had at home in Ottawa before election day, they looked exhausted and almost emotional. And who can blame them? I would be too. And so I think they're trying to get some rest. But he's still working. I think he's basically spending all day on the phone with supporters, with members of caucus, trying to gather insights on how people felt the election went. I think he's meeting with his advisors. He's giving a lot of thought to all of this. And as I understand it, caucus is likely to meet next week in Ottawa. There's orientation for new members of parliament, so that's a natural time to do it. And I imagine the public will be hearing a bit more from Poilievre around that time as well. I wouldn't be surprised if he sort of speaks to the plans in the lead up to the next election. Maybe there'll be some sort of review that's undertaken to look at ways that the party can do even better. I think he does need to do that. By the way, I think he needs to sort of take some accountability for not having won. He should dwell on the successes, certainly, but he should also take some accountability for not having won and maybe gesture at some openness to change and to evolution. And knowing him, even though he probably needs a lot of rest, I actually imagine he's not taking much because he can't sit still. He cannot sit still for very long.
Yes. Well, look, that actually segues into where I wanted to take you next, and that is, what went wrong? I mean, I know Trump appeared on the scene, but Trump is, it'll all be over in months as far as things will get resolved one way or the other. Once they're resolved, then we're back to dealing with the same things. Young people who can't afford homes, haven't got jobs, older people fighting with inflation, all the same problems that we went in. So there were some people who thought that he should have become a militant anti-Trumper. He didn't. He said what he needed to say, I think, but he focused on those same issues that were there before and that will be there again. I didn't think he made a mistake, but you're saying there are elements of where he needs to take accountability. So what are they?
Yeah, I agree with your assessment, by the way. I think it's very simplistic and not good analysis to say, well, he should have talked about Trump every day, or he should have been very hardline about Trump and talked about him every day. I think had he done that, he would have accepted that as the ballot question, and voters would have chosen Mark Carney as their preference for that question. Instead, he sort of he addressed the Trump issue. He presented his plan, but he spent more time talking about cost of living and crime, two major areas of contrast where he and Carney are different, and where voters were, I think, much more motivated to vote for him if they felt like he was right on those issues. I think that was like basically the way to go. And I would say I think strategically the campaign was almost right on the money. I think it was very well done. The areas for improvement that I see are on the sort of tactical operational side of things. For instance, thousands and thousands of Canadians showed up to these rallies, and these were not people who'd been Conservative Party members before, maybe not even Conservative voters before, maybe not even voters at all before. And they had a real emotional connection to Poilievre, a real connection to the issues. People who showed up at rallies, and also people who engage with his social media content. I'd like to see more thought go into, over the long term, how do you convert those people into activists and volunteers? How do you get them to join their riding association? How do you get them to show up on E-Day and pull vote like we all do? Those of us who've been activists for years. How do we get them to get their friends to show up? How do we basically convert those rally goers and voters? And give him credit. They didn't just show up rallies. They definitely voted. But how do we get them to volunteer? How do we get their manpower on election day? How do we nominate candidates sooner so that we can have more candidates identifying more vote at the doors and then getting out the vote on election day? These are problems, I should say, that plague all political parties. Political parties just in 2025, they just can't get enough volunteers. They can't get enough activists. But I think we have an opportunity that the other parties don't, in that we have this movement that Poilievre has built. So converting that movement into a machine, a political machine, I think is like the biggest area for growth and opportunity.
Right. Given that the NDP collapsed almost entirely, is there actually anything that a cleverer, smarter critic might have been able to do that the campaign didn't do?
Well, you make a good point. So there are a lot of areas of the country where the Conservative number is higher than it's ever been. But because the NDP number was so low, so historically low, the Liberals still beat us because the NDP collapsed almost entirely in some ridings to the Liberals. Having said that, the NDP collapse is also attributable to many NDP voters voting Conservative. So whether it's Windsor or Hamilton, Ontario, or more blue-collar working class parts of the province, or North Vancouver Island, also, more natural resources, fishing community, blue-collar type Conservatives who are worried about drugs and crime. These are many voters who went from the NDP to the Conservatives. And I see that as a huge opportunity. I also think it's a good reason why we shouldn't hang our future hopes on some hope that the NDP will do better, because we want to keep those voters. And so we really have to think about how do we go from 42% to 46%, 47% in a potentially almost a two-party system.
I think the number is 49.3%.
Yeah, sure. Now, look, we may get lucky, right? The NDP are likely at a low watermark historically. If they get a new leader and that leader gets some engaging media, they may pick up a few points. And if they do, I think it will be at the expense of the Liberals. That's great. I hope that happens. But we need to build a sort of like a 50% plus one style movement, to your point, or 49.3%, because that to me is the more durable way of building a long-term coalition that can succeed in a potentially two-party system.
Certainly, I think it's pretty possible to hang on to some of those blue-collar NDP supporters. They are actually true Conservatives in the sense that they don't want anything to change. They've got things the way they want them, and that's Vancouver Island. I happened to be there when the Reform Party was becoming established, and people were coming across from the NDP to join hands with Conservatives who were fed up, and that's how the Reform Party started out there. Same thing is possible today, I do believe. But can I just take you to this is a touchy subject because it's got to do with the internal struggles of the Conservative Party. And we've seen this every decade, that Conservatives would rather fight with each other than the Liberals. And you have this bizarre situation that there's bad blood between the Poilievre campaign and the people who work for Doug Ford. And the only explanation I've seen in print is that, oh, well, somebody said something nasty to somebody else and everybody took umbrage. And then with that, they started to bring down the person most likely to replace the Liberals after 10 years of misrule. That doesn't make much sense to me. What do you think happened there?
I think Conservatives care more, and that's why we have these fights. Really, I think I think there's more substance to the disagreement, as you implied. And I think it started at the tail end of COVID, when many of us were saying that some of the restrictions were just too significant. And indeed, Poilievre was, I think, quite successful in his leadership campaign, in part because he questioned a lot of the remaining discriminatory restrictions. And in hindsight, it seems like most people agree that we shouldn't have had kids out of school for so long, etc. Um, and the Ford government was quite a bit more dogmatic about keeping things shut down, about restrictions, etc. And I think that was sort of the beginning of the disagreements. And then over time, you had people like Jamil Jabani and others who were drawn to the federal Conservative Party around a lot of the anti-woke stuff. And Poilievre was very committed as well to coming out against DEI and the federal government, cutting funding for universities that pursue this ridiculous ideology, etc. And you just didn't see the same thing happening in Ontario, despite us having a majority government there. Us meaning Conservatives, like ostensibly Conservatives are in control in Ontario and have been for some time, and yet you don't see progress on some of these issues. And so I think there are genuine ideological differences. Ultimately, I think probably did become personal, as many of these things do. And I hope that we can continue to disagree on the key policy areas, because that is, a substantive area where you want to tell voters where you stand, and and if it's different from others, you should make that clear. But the sort of like added personal stuff is probably not necessary and probably not additive to a big coalition. And so I hope that part can kind of be put to bed and we can stick to the issues.
Well, I guess we all held that, but you make a very good point. There were people saying before the election that although the Liberal Party called itself Liberal, it didn't look like any Liberal Party that we'd ever seen prior to the Stephen Harper government. It seemed much more like well, I don't know what it was like. They said it was like an NDP government, but I don't think even the NDP was always quite that crazy.
That's right.
At any rate, and so now we've got what have we got in Ontario? A Conservative Party that's
It's sort
not
of a
conservative in the
populist
same.
centrist party, I would say. Like, I don't know that there is much of a core worldview there,
No.
or a set of objectives. So.
This is it's an odd thing when it is actually Conservatives who want to change things. How do you market the idea of being a Conservative and wanting to reform everything you see in front of you?
Reform, I think, is the right word. And I think the way, the rationale for me, because I am a Conservative, and I sort of have this like intuitive fallback to common sense and to not wanting to disrupt, etc. But I think the reality is, when you apply that worldview to a country that's been under, not just, as you say, liberal, but pretty hard left progressive rule for a decade, that it has moved so far away from common sense that there is a sense that reform is needed in order to restore. Like, I think of it more as restoration than I do reform towards some brave new future. I think it's much more about a return to common sense, but that requires reform.
Jenny, do you make a connection between this intra-party spat, between that and somebody's bold leadership aspirations, who may even have engineered the situation to weaken Poilievre so that somebody else could step up and claim the leadership?
I honestly don't know. When I don't see a rationale, or when I don't see an obvious rationale behind someone's behavior, I sometimes think, is there something else going on here? Are there, in politics, sometimes that looks like ambition, or personal interest, business interest, whatever. But I don't know. I can't tell you. I don't know how Albertans or people out west would feel about Doug Ford as a federal Conservative leadership candidate. I don't know how Francophone Canadians would feel about someone who doesn't speak French. There's a bunch of reasons why it doesn't seem to make all that much sense to me. But you never know.
Well, as having editorialized for many, many decades, I have peeled back the onion layers. When you get right down to the bottom, you often find just plain stupidity and malice. So it could be just nothing more than that. But I had to ask. Also have to ask. Mr. Carney is very, very close to a majority. I think 172 is needed. He has 169. if I can ask you to do something really hard, and that is to imagine that you were advising the Liberal Prime Minister, would you perhaps suggest he recruit a few people from the opposition?
That isn't so hard. As a consultant, I often have to put myself in the shoes of my opponents in my private life. Well, I think what I would advise is I would say to Mark Carney, look, you actually have three dance partners. You have NDP MPs, you have the Bloc, and you even have Conservatives. And were I him, I think I would try to approach a parliamentary agenda by having smaller bills, not these big omnibus trying to jam everything into a fall economic statement or a big budget. Obviously, you have to do those things as well. But I would go on a case by case basis and say, who is the best dance partner for me on this legislation to advance what I want to advance? And surely he'll find it. I think on a lot of his progressive climate agenda, etc. Yes, he will go to the NDP. But he may have a major project piece of legislation he wants to bring forward. The Conservatives may feel pressure to support if they want to see major projects built. He may have an approach to dealing with Trump that the Conservatives may feel pressure to support. He may have other policies that the Bloc could get behind if he can't get the NDP to support him. And the NDP, look, more often than not, I think the NDP are going to fall in with the Liberals. But I think that if I were him, that is how I would resist being just drawn into this dynamic where I have to move to the left on every issue. Now, will he do that? I'm not so sure. I think there are a lot of people out there who think Mark Carney is this great business liberal, Paul Merton-esque, blue liberal type, and I don't think that's true. I mean, this is the guy who wrote the book on net zero, on like the radical climate agenda. He wears an expensive suit, but that is not making him business liberal. So we will see if he takes my approach. I think more likely he will take a Trudeau-like approach of appealing to the NDP and running as though he has a de facto majority. And I don't even think he needs to have them switch parties to do that. I think they'll just vote with the Liberals.
So what you're really recommending is the model that Stephen Harper used in 2006.
Exactly. Yep. I think that was wise of Harper at the time, and I think it would be wise for Carney to do it now. I'm not sure he will.
Well, fascinating insights. We're almost out of time, and I want to thank you, Jenny, for coming on the show. Any last words?
No, all I will say is actually I feel a lot of optimism as a Conservative. Obviously, I wanted to win the federal election. There's no question that's disappointing. But this new coalition of voters is young and energetic and different from anything we've seen. And I think it is more durable and easier to grow than the Liberal coalition, which I think has hit its ceiling. And so I hope some of your viewers will take some hope in that message.
Well, I have one last question from which they might derive. Do you think we'll be going to the polls again within 12 months?
Unfortunately, I don't have a hopeful answer to that question. I think because the NDP is so not functioning like a proper political party right now, they're so broke, they are so they have no future. They don't have a leader. I think for all those reasons, it'll be easy for the Liberals to pass legislation. And I don't think anyone apart from the Conservatives is going to want an election in the next couple of years.
Jenny Roth from Crestview Strategies, thank you very much for joining the show today. Very much appreciate your insights. For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.